My daughter told me to wait in the lobby. She said it in front of 14 people on a Friday night at the restaurant she built with money she borrowed against my name, and I stood there in my work coat with dried paint on my sleeve, and I let every word of it land before I did a single thing. Then the event coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who I'd seen every time I'd been to that restaurant, walked over to where I was standing, held out a folder, and said, "The total for this evening is 6,200, Mr. Calloway, whenever you're ready." She hadn't heard what Lauren had just said to me. She was just doing her job the way she always did. She knew whose name was on the account. I looked at the folder. I looked at my daughter. Then I set that folder down on the nearest table, turned around, and walked back out through the front door into the cold without saying a single word. I don't think anyone at that table understood what had just happened, and that's what I want to tell you about. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years as a commercial painter, the industrial kind, not the decorating kind. I painted water towers and bridge supports and the insides of warehouses. I came home most nights smelling like solvent and primer, with paint under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever got completely clean. I raised my daughter Lauren on my own from the time she was 9 years old, after her mother moved to Phoenix to marry someone who worked in finance and didn't have children of his own. Lauren stayed with me. That was her choice. I want you to know that she chose me, and I spent the next 12 years making sure she never had reason to regret that choice. We lived in a two-bedroom house in Youngstown, Ohio, that I'd bought the year Lauren was born. Nothing impressive about it. Small yard, old windows that leaked cold air in January, a furnace that made a sound like a cough every time it kicked on. But I owned it clean and clear by the time Lauren was in middle school. No mortgage, no debt. Just a paid-off house that I'd worked for. And I was proud of that. In the quiet way, you're proud of something you did without anyone watching. Lauren was a smart kid, the kind of smart that made teachers stop and pay attention. She read everything. She argued about things. She had opinions at 10 years old that most adults couldn't back up. I drove her to model UN competitions, 2 states over. I sat in school auditoriums watching her debate students from schools that spent more on a single classroom than our whole district spent on everything combined. And I watched her look around at those other schools, and I saw something happen behind her eyes that I didn't quite have words for at the time. She wasn't ashamed of me. I want to be clear about that. Not then, not when she was young, but she was aware of the distance between where we were and where some people lived. And she was the kind of person who measured that distance carefully and filed it away somewhere private. She got into the hospitality management program at Cornell, partial scholarship, and I covered the rest by taking on extra contracts through the summers, weekend jobs, anything that came available. I didn't tell her how tight things were because she would have offered to go somewhere cheaper, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Some sacrifices you make because you want to, and some you make because there's simply no other version of the story you can live with. When she graduated, she had a plan she'd been building for 2 years without telling me the details. She wanted to open a restaurant, not a diner, not a neighborhood spot, a real restaurant, upscale, the kind with a curated menu and a reservations list and a wine program managed by somebody with a certification. She'd spent 2 years studying the business side, the branding, the numbers. She knew exactly what she wanted. What she didn't have was the money to make a bank take her seriously. She came to me one night in the kitchen of my house in Youngstown, and she laid out the whole plan across the table. She was 27 years old, and she looked like she'd been practicing that conversation in her head for a month. She needed a cosigner. She needed someone with a real credit history and a piece of property to put behind a business loan. She'd done the math on what the house was worth. She looked across the table at me and said, "Dad, I know this is asking a lot." I told her it wasn't. I signed the paperwork inside of a week. The loan was for $1.8 million. I remortgaged the house on Garfield Street, the house I'd paid off, the house Lauren had grown up in, the house I'd planned to retire inside of, and I put my name behind every dollar of that loan with a personal guarantee that meant if copper and salt failed, the bank would come for my house first. There was one other thing we worked out that I want to tell you about honestly, because it matters to what happened later. Lauren's attorney set up an ownership structure where I held 35% of the restaurant as a silent partner. Silent on paper, silent in practice. Lauren would run the restaurant. My name would not appear in any public materials. She said, and I understood her reasoning at the time, that investors and press responded better to a single founder narrative. A clean story. A young woman who built something from nothing. And she asked me, gently, if I'd be willing to stay out of the public-facing version of that story. I told her yes. I told myself she was right about the branding. I told myself it was a small thing to give up. It wasn't a small thing. I just wouldn't understand that for several more years. Copper and Salt opened in Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood called Lawrenceville that had been turning over for a decade, and was finally the kind of place where a restaurant like Lauren's made sense. I stood in the back on opening night in the one decent blazer I owned, and I watched my daughter shake hands with food writers and local investors like she'd been doing it her whole life. Nobody introduced me as her father. I was just a quiet man in a blazer near the back wall who smiled when anyone looked over. I told myself that watching her succeed was more than enough. Within 4 years, Copper and Salt had been written up in 3 national food publications. Lauren had opened a second location in Shadyside. She'd hired a full management team, a sommelier, a pastry chef who'd trained in Lyon. The self-made narrative had taken hold in the way those narratives do when someone is genuinely talented and the press is genuinely paying attention. Articles called her visionary. One piece in a Philadelphia magazine described her as a first-generation restaurateur who built her name from the ground up with nothing but skill and nerve. I read that line sitting at my kitchen table in Youngstown, and I put the magazine down and I went outside and stood in the yard for a while before I could go back in. That same year, Lauren started seeing a man named Graham Aldrich. Graham's family was Pittsburgh old money, not the flashy kind, but the quiet institutional kind, the kind that has a named scholarship at Carnegie Mellon and sits on the board of the symphony. His father, Robert Aldrich, had built a logistics company worth something north of $300 million over the course of 40 years. Robert was the sort of man who asked careful questions and listened to the answers and drew his own conclusions, slowly but permanently. Lauren and Graham got serious quickly. The Aldrich family welcomed her in a way that I think surprised even Lauren. They respected her success, her self-sufficiency, the fact that she'd built something real. And I noticed in the months that followed that the version of her story she told in those rooms had gotten cleaner. The house in Youngstown didn't come up. The loan didn't come up. My name didn't come up. When Graham's family held a dinner to celebrate their engagement at the Shadyside location of Copper and Salt, my daughter's restaurant, my guarantee behind the walls, Lauren introduced me to Robert Aldrich as her father's old business associate. Not her father. Not Frank Calloway, who signed his house over to a bank so this restaurant could exist. His old business associate. I shook Robert's hand and said congratulations and smiled and found my seat at a table near the kitchen door. And something cracked open inside my chest in a place I didn't know I'd been protecting. I told myself I understood. I told myself it was just for the evening. I told myself a lot of things in those years that I'm not proud of anymore. 3 more years passed like that. Family gatherings where I was background noise. Holidays where Graham's parents and siblings filled the center of the room, and I sat to the side and was polite and asked questions about people I barely knew. Lauren called me regularly, invited me to things, and I always came. But in every room that mattered, I was edited out. Then in the spring, Lauren called to tell me she was hosting a dinner at the flagship Copper and Salt location in Lawrenceville, a celebration for Robert Aldrich's 45th business anniversary. An important evening. Clients, colleagues, family. She said it would mean a lot to her if I were there. I'd been on a contract job in Cleveland all week, painting the interior of a new commercial building on the east side. Long days, physical work, the kind that settles into your shoulders by Thursday. Lauren called on Thursday evening while I was still on site. I didn't have time to drive back to Youngstown to clean up and turn around and drive to Pittsburgh. I told her I'd come straight from Cleveland after the crew wrapped for the day. She said, "Of course, Dad. Just get here." I drove 2.5 hours in my work truck, in my work coat, with paint on my forearms that I'd scrubbed at a gas station sink and mostly gotten off. I parked 2 blocks from the restaurant because the street was full. I walked to the entrance, carrying the weight of a full week's work in my back and legs, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could name, genuinely hopeful. She'd asked me to be there. She'd said it would mean something. Through the front window of Copper and Salt, I could see the private dining room was glowing with candlelight. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces with garden roses, servers moving carefully between chairs. The Aldrich family, 24 of them at least, dressed in the careful, effortless way that people dress when they've never had to think about what clothes cost. I straightened my coat as best I could and walked through the door. The host recognized me and nodded me toward the private room without checking anything. I'd been at that restaurant enough times over the years that the staff knew my face, even if they didn't know exactly why. Lauren saw me from across the room. I watched the same thing happen that I'd seen happen before, a shift, quick and involuntary, behind her eyes. She was across the room before I'd taken 4 steps. She kept her voice low. Dad, she said, you came straight from the job site. I told her I had. I told her I was sorry about the coat, but that I'd come as fast as I could. She looked back over her shoulder toward the Aldrich tables. Robert Aldrich was watching with the patient, measuring expression of a man who has made a lifetime of reading rooms. His wife, Catherine, leaned slightly toward the woman beside her. Graham, standing near his father, went still. Lauren turned back to me, and her voice when she spoke was different from any voice she'd used with me before. Quiet but carrying. The kind of voice that reaches further than it seems like it should. Dad, this is a private event. I can't have you in here like this tonight. There's a waiting area in the front. You can sit there, and I'll come find you when things wind down. The room didn't go silent. It was worse than that. A few people nearby heard. I could tell by the way they adjusted, the way their eyes went somewhere careful and polite. Graham's younger brother said something to the woman beside him, and they both glanced over. Robert Aldrich kept watching with that same unreadable expression. I stood there for a moment, and I thought about 35 years of getting up before dawn. I thought about a mortgage I'd paid off and then signed back over to a bank. I thought about $1.8 million in my name at the bottom of a stack of documents. I thought about a dining room table spread with Lauren's business plan and me saying yes before she finished asking. And then I felt it, not anger exactly, but something that had been waiting underneath the anger for a long time. A clarity. Quiet and absolute and cold. Priya, the event coordinator, had come around the corner from the service hallway. She had a folder in her hand. She'd been handling private event billing for Copper and Salt since the Shadyside location opened, and she knew the drill for family dinners. She walked past Lauren without noticing the conversation we'd just had, and held the folder out in my direction. Mr. Calloway, she said, the full event total is $6,200. Whenever you're ready to close out tonight. She turned and went back toward the service area before anyone could say anything. I held that folder for a moment. I looked at the number. $6,200 for a table I'd just been told I couldn't sit at. I set the folder down on the nearest empty surface, flat and careful, without making a sound. I looked at my daughter. I held her eyes for a moment, not with anger, with something quieter and more final than anger. And then I buttoned my coat, turned around, and walked back through the restaurant and out the front door into the April night. I drove home to Youngstown in the dark with the radio off. Not because I was performing composure, I just didn't have anything left that needed sound. I drove and I thought, and by the time I pulled into the driveway on Garfield Street, I knew what I was going to do in the morning. My neighbor across the street, a man named Dennis Achterberg, had been a contracts attorney in Pittsburgh for 32 years before he semi-retired and started consulting part-time. We'd been neighbors for 11 years. He'd helped me read through the original Copper and Salt loan documents when I signed them, flagging the sections that mattered. I called him from my kitchen at 9 o'clock that night and told him I needed to meet. We sat at my kitchen table the next morning with the Copper and Salt Holdings LLC operating agreement spread out between us, the same documents I'd signed 7 years earlier. Dennis read through them slowly, with the particular stillness of someone who is finding exactly what he expected to find. He set his pen down and looked up. Frank, he said, your personal guarantee comes up for renewal with the bank in 11 weeks. It's tied to annual review because the collateral is your primary residence. You can decline the renewal. The bank has to be notified in writing 60 days in advance. He tapped another section. You also have a forced buyout clause here. If the other party has materially misrepresented the ownership structure to third parties, business partners, press, lenders, you can invoke it and require either a buyout of your 35% at fair market value or a full disclosure filing. Given what's been in those magazine articles, that clause is almost certainly applicable. I sat with that for a while. Then I told Dennis I wanted to send the bank a formal written notice that I would not be renewing my personal guarantee on the next review cycle. And I wanted him to draft a letter invoking the forced buyout clause, giving Lauren 90 days to buy out my 35% at a professionally appraised valuation. Dennis nodded slowly. I'll have everything drafted by the end of the week, he said. I drove back to Cleveland Monday morning and finished the contract job. I didn't call Lauren. She called me twice, and I let it go to voicemail and listened to the messages later. She sounded like herself, slightly rushed, asking if I was okay about the other night, saying she was sorry things got complicated. The bank notified Copper and Salt Holdings 11 weeks later that the personal guarantee on the original commercial loan would not be renewed under current terms, and that the business had 30 days to secure alternative collateral or a new guarantor or the loan would be called for immediate repayment. I found out later from Dennis that Lauren's loan officer had called her personally the same afternoon the letter arrived and walked her through, line by line, the structure of the original loan. The house on Garfield Street as primary collateral. My signature on 19 pages of documents. The 35% ownership stake that had been sitting quietly in my name since before Copper and Salt served its first customer. Lauren had signed where her attorney told her to sign 7 years ago, and had trusted the way children trust their parents to handle what they said they'd handle, that I'd taken care of the parts I'd agreed to. Take care of. She hadn't looked at those documents closely since. She'd been too busy building the life that those documents had quietly made possible. Her attorney called Dennis 2 days after the bank letter arrived. Lauren called me 17 times over the following week. I let all 17 calls go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty, because I genuinely had nothing left to say by phone that I hadn't already said in that restaurant by walking out the door. On the 9th day, she drove to Youngstown. She knocked. She didn't walk in the way she used to. She stood on the porch of the house that had been mortgaged for her dream and waited for me to open the door. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The professional polish was still there, but worn thin, the way good paint looks before it starts to peel. She was 38 years old and standing on a porch where she'd grown up, and she looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone who wasn't sure she was welcome. I opened the door and I let her in, and I made coffee, and we sat at the same table where she'd spread out her business plan 11 years ago. She asked me why I was doing this. After everything. After all the years I'd stayed quiet and let things be however she needed them to be. I told her the truth in the plain way you learn to speak when you've spent too many years softening what you actually mean. I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was just done doing something for her that she had spent 7 years pretending didn't exist. I told her that pulling my guarantee wasn't punishment. It was just me finally treating my own name and my own house the way she'd taught me to treat them, like something to be used quietly and kept out of sight when it wasn't convenient. She was quiet for a long time, both hands around her mug, not drinking from it. Then she started talking. And for once, I didn't interrupt and didn't soften anything she said to protect either of us from it. She told me she'd been ashamed. Not of me exactly, but of the version of the story she thought she needed to have. She'd wanted so badly to be the person those articles described, the first-generation founder, built from nothing, that she'd slowly erased the part of the story that made it true in a way she could actually live with. She'd erased me to protect a narrative, and the narrative had become more real to her than I had. She said she understood now what that meant. She said she understood it because Robert Aldrich, who had built his entire career on the principle that a man is nothing without the people who actually put something behind him, had found out. I hadn't known this yet. She told me the story quietly. Robert had heard from his own attorney, who'd heard from someone in Pittsburgh's business community who'd seen the loan notice filing, that Copper and Salt's original financing had been carried entirely by a personal guarantee from Lauren's father, the same father she'd introduced as an old business associate at his son's engagement dinner. Robert had called Graham into his office and asked him directly whether this was true. Graham had confirmed it. And then Robert had called Lauren. Lauren told me that her father-in-law had been almost completely silent on the phone, which she said was worse than anything he could have said. He told her that he had spent 45 years building something because people had taken chances on him, his first mentor, a man who'd put his own reputation on the line for Robert's first contract, and that there was one kind of person he had no interest in remaining close to, and that was someone who accepted everything another person risked and then arranged for that person to disappear from the story. He hadn't been angry. He'd been clear. And Lauren said that was so much worse. She told me Graham was still with her, that he hadn't left, but that something between them had shifted in the way things shift. When you find out the story you believed about someone has an entire chapter that was deliberately left out. She said she saw him looking at her sometimes now, the way you look at something you thought you understood completely. The flagship Lawrenceville location closed 4 months later. Without my guarantee behind the original loan, and without enough personal credit history or liquid assets to secure new terms in time, the bank called the note. The Shadyside location held on for another 2 months before it followed. Only the original space, the corner restaurant in Pittsburgh where Lauren had opened everything, survived. Scaled back, different, quieter. I didn't take any satisfaction in watching it happen. I want you to understand that. I had loved that restaurant the way you love something you poured real risk into. Watching it contract was not a relief. But I also didn't step in, because for the first time in her adult life, Lauren was standing fully inside the consequences of her own choices, with nobody quietly standing behind her to absorb the impact. She called me 2 months after that Sunday visit. Then she called again. We started talking the way we used to when she was in college, and would call on Sunday evenings to tell me about her week. Slowly, imperfectly, from the beginning. In October, she came back to Youngstown for a weekend. We drove out to look at some properties she was thinking about. Smaller scale, different approach, something she could build on terms that were actually hers. We ate at a diner on the way back, and she introduced me to the woman behind the counter as my dad, and then kept talking like it was nothing. It was not nothing. Robert Aldrich reached out to me directly that winter. Lauren had apparently told him the full story, the real one, and he'd asked her for my number. He called one evening and we talked for almost an hour. He was a different man than the one I'd seen watching me from across a candlelit room. He told me that what I'd done, remortgaging a paid-off house for a child's dream, staying quiet about it for 7 years, and then walking away with dignity when I'd been told to sit in the lobby was the kind of thing that told you everything about a person's character. He said he wished he'd known the real story earlier. He said a man who put his house behind his daughter's dream deserved a seat at any table in any room. I thanked him. I meant it. I still work. Not because I have to, the guarantee is gone. The house is mine again, free and clear once more. And I've got enough set aside. I work because it's who I am. I still come home with primer on my forearms and grit in my collar, and I still feel, at the end of a good day, the particular satisfaction of having made something hold that wasn't holding before. Lauren runs the one remaining restaurant now. She runs it with her name fully on it, and her own credit, and her own collateral, and the kind of pride that comes from knowing the ground under you is actually yours. She calls me every Sunday. She came to Youngstown for Thanksgiving, and she sat at my kitchen table, and she introduced me to her new sous chef, a young woman who'd come along to pick up some equipment from storage, and she said, "This is my dad, Frank. He taught me what it means to build something that lasts." I thought about that for a long time after they left. I thought about all the years I'd stood in the back of rooms and told myself that being needed quietly was enough. And I thought about the moment in that candlelit restaurant when I set down a folder with $6,200 in it and walked out the door. That moment didn't break anything worth keeping. It just finally showed me, plain as anything, what it actually cost to stay silent and gave me the reason to stop.